Good. Well, now we come to the real event of this evening, and I'm simply delighted that we can welcome Dr. Iain Gordon Brown, former president of the Society and a great friend to very many of us. However, let me give you a very short bio. Iain Gordon Brown is a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries in London and also of the Royal Society in Edinburgh, and he was formerly principal curator of manuscripts at the National Library in Edinburgh. He was also the curator of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, of which Walter Scott, of course, was the third president. Iain Gordon Brown is a really widely published author. He's a past president of the club, as I said. He's a member of the Curatorial Expert Advisory Committee of the Abbotsford Trust and of the Faculty of Advocates Joint Abbotsford Advisory Committee. He was formerly president of the Old Edinburgh Club, and he's a trustee of Edinburgh World Heritage. Coming to his book and background, in a sense, for this, Walter Scott wrote a lot about his desire to travel in Europe. In actual fact, he only made 3 continental trips. The first 2, as you would remember, were to Belgium when he looked at the site of Waterloo and northern France and Paris. He steeped himself in local culture and conversation, and then out of this came his striking book, Paul's Letters to His Kinsfolk, in 1816, which I'm actually currently reading and thoroughly enjoying. His characterization of the French is very witty and very modern. Then shortly before his death, Walter Scott sailed to the Mediterranean on board an Admiralty ship, warship, which they loaned him for this as an honor. Now, Iain Gordon Brown's book, Frolics in the Face of Europe, the phrase comes from a letter of Walter Scott's in 1824, draws on his enormous correspondence and his journal, obviously his novels and other writings, and it gives a fresh sense of Walter Scott's outlook on the world and engagement with it as we celebrate his 250th year. And so, Iain, could I ask you if you would give your talk, which we very much look forward to.
Thank you, Iain. You've almost given it for me, so I wonder whether we should just open the wine now and enjoy the rest of the evening. But good evening, everybody. It's a very great pleasure and a very great honor to be speaking to you tonight. As all of us gathered round our computer screens well know, this summer sees the 250th anniversary of the birth of our hero, Sir Walter Scott. Many Scott scholars will perhaps have wanted to write something fresh on the subject of their long-term interests, and equally many Scott enthusiasts may have wanted to read a new book that looked at Sir Walter from a different perspective, or to consider a treatment of him both novel and stimulating. As both a Scott scholar and as a Scott admirer, I find myself in no different a position when I began to weigh up the chances of being myself able to write such a book on a new aspect of Scott for publication in time for the 250th anniversary. It so happened that there was an aspect of Scott's life and outlook that had long interested me, in which no one else had really investigated in the precise way that I had it in mind to explore the topic. The notion that was going round in my head was the relationship between Scott and the tradition of the Grand Tour. Even if one accepts that Scott himself travelled on 3 occasions to and in Europe, the hard facts are that he went only on those 3 occasions. Did any of those trips constitute what might be termed a grand tour or anything like it? Ample evidence suggested that Scott was, at best, but a reluctant continental traveller. His life appeared full of endless excuses not to go abroad. Why was this? How did his view relate to or compare with those of many of his contemporaries? George Ellis, James Skene, J.B.S. Morritt, for example, all recipients of dedications of cantos in Marmion, who did travel widely and frequently. The Grand Tour as an institution or historic rite of passage in the educational and cultural development of generations of Britons was already outmoded by the time Scott might have been able to join in an almost exhausted tradition. But a new kind of European travel with different psychological and intellectual priorities was actually coming in to replace old routes and former ways of reacting to the traditional, very largely classical mindset of the old-style tourist. This was subject to much less in the way of prescribed diets, of cultural acquisition on defined itineraries, requiring visits to specific sites in a specific order, to see the same ruins, or to tour the same galleries, to gawp at the same statues and the same pictures. Scott was not really classically inclined. And that being the case, he should really have been only too pleased to see the world with the eyes of a romantic, looking principally at the life of the modern people of Spain and France and Germany or Italy, praising the medieval cathedral, abbey, castle, or hill town over Roman amphitheatre, arch, or temple, and writing ecstatically on the altarpiece or the suit of tournament armour rather than on the tired and hackneyed Apollo Belvedere or Callipygian Venus. Post-1815 was an ideal time for an anti-classic, or at any rate, a half-hearted classicist to travel new roads. Scott should have preferred individual ways through the Alps, appreciating the picturesque and the sublime, rather than the well-trodden path through the Roman Forum, guidebook or Cicero to hand, just feeling schoolroom classical, as everybody else had done for several generations past. He should have been of his own generation in admiring the Rhine before the Tiber or the Po. But Scott was not really very interested in all this either. His focus was very much domestic. The Tweed beat all other rivers any day, and it was his stream. The Eildons may not have been higher than the Alps or the Apennines, but they were his hills. Abbotsford was certainly no Versailles, no Schönbrunn, no Caserta, no Quirinal Palace in the heart of papal Rome. It was not even a Malmaison, a Ferney, or a Villa Capro in the Veneto, but it was his creation, his Delilah, as he called it. Edinburgh may have been small and provincial in comparison with Paris, and its buildings incomparably less grandiose than those of the Rome of Bernini or Borromini, but it was Scott's own romantic town, his birthplace and the focus of his society and the seat of his legal work and world. The Bay of Naples may have been incomparably beautiful, as Scott well knew from literature, with its view closed by the silhouette of Capri and the cones of Vesuvius. But so was the prospect of Edinburgh from Leith Roads, splendid in its own way, with the island of Inchkeith doing duty for Ischia, and Arthur's Seat, a superannuated and more beneficent volcano. You couldn't have a traditional grand tour worth the name that did not have Italy for its goal, and within that geographical region, Rome and Naples as its climactic points. Ironically, in the end, Scott left a visit to Italy to the last. Essentially, he did not have the taste and inclination to be a grand tourist of past tradition. Italian music left him unmoved. The visual arts mattered comparatively little. The architecture of classical antiquity or the Renaissance or the Baroque was not what he liked. He was not actually the linguist with an easy facility for assimilating modern languages that he claimed to be. Scottish history and Scottish topography always proved more interesting and attractive than anything to be encountered abroad. And here I'll show one of the three images that I'm going to show. It's a print of the Watson-Gordon retrospective and imaginative view of Scott in his study. He's surrounded by images that evoke the Scottish past, the suit of armour, the crossed broadswords between the targe, redolent of Jacobite history. There's nothing in this picture that suggests anything outside Scotland, and indeed the map of Scotland behind his head forms a sort of nimbus round him. Scott is Scotland. But still, in the later 1810s or even up to the early 1820s, Scott might have made something of a trip or trips in something of the old Grand Tour style. There might even have been novels set in ancient Rome or medieval Florence. And surely the Lazzaroni of Naples were just waiting to be immortalized as subsidiary characters in a tale set on the slopes of Vesuvius. But when he actually agreed to be carried to the Mediterranean by the Royal Navy and accompanied by members of his family through 4 months in Naples, 3 weeks in Rome, and some shorter periods in northern Italian cities on the way back to Britain, he had to face the hard fact that he'd left it all too late. For by the time he arrived in Malta in November 1831, age and illness made it impossible for him to enjoy what he might just possibly have enjoyed in Mediterranean lands in his prime. Why then write a book on Walter Scott, continental travel, and the tradition of the Grand Tour? Because the paradoxes, contradictions, and the strong sense of might have been are fascinating. Scott often wrote in a rather dismissive, even demeaning way about European travel as a frisk or a frolic. One comment he made on the behaviour of a nouveau riche and vulgar London broker whom his friend William Clark had encountered in Rome provided my title. Adapted from a letter of Scott's of 1824, this became the rather memorable and striking Frolics in the Face of Europe. Well, that title has certainly attracted attention, even if it has not, quite frankly, increased sales. Frolics is the book not about Club 1830, sun, sand, sea, sex, and sangria, or elderly coach parties behaving badly. However, and quite seriously, the real problem is not that of frolicking in Europe or the Grand Tour, which topics might be classified as subjects on the one hand racy and on the other socially smart and culturally significant. The problem, I'm afraid to say, is Scott. Although we may think, quite rightly of course, that the study of his life and work is endlessly fascinating, we are regrettably in the minority. He's not now, I fear, widely regarded as a fashionable man or as an easy-to-read writer. He's dead, white, perceived as posh, heavy-going, long-winded, Tory, unionist, the last two not making him flavour of the month, even a 250th anniversary month in today's Scotland. A saying such as Thomas Carlyle's of Scott, that no sounder piece of British manhood was put together in that 18th century of time, may not be exactly in accord with the sentiments of today's Britain, with its no platforming cancel culture and its virtue signalling angst about almost everything in the past. Then there's this conundrum too. Those who are interested in the Grand Tour are not generally interested in Scott. And those interested in Scott, quite possibly, do not much concern themselves with the study of the Grand Tour. My book combines two of the major pursuits of my own scholarly career: the life, work, and world of Scott on the one hand, and the history and legacy of the Grand Tour on the other. I'd not the slightest doubt that I would derive great satisfaction in writing about these subjects in juxtaposition. If I could actually get the book out in 2020, which was indeed the case, That would place it at another significant commemorative moment. For 2020 saw the 350th anniversary of the first use of the term Grand Tour by Richard Lascelles in his The Voyage of Italy of 1670, an influential work that in an early manuscript version had actually been written as a guide for a Scottish noble. Constructing a book called Frolics in the Face of Europe in the febrile atmosphere of a disunited kingdom locked in the Brexit quagmire of late 2019, early 2020, was an exercise shot through with nuance. Such a pity that's a French word. And when the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic came along, another form of resonance came into play. In the Mediterranean in 1831, Scott had experienced quarantines and had had to practice social distancing in the Malta lazaretto. His journal was peppered with terms such as captivity, confinement, and imprisonment. So never let it be said that the study of early 19th century social or literary history, or that of the wider Grand Tour, are topics that do not have contemporary reverberations. Now, I don't just enjoy and find myself intellectually stimulated by the study of Scott and his world. I'm also devoted to Scott as a most marvelous human being, endowed with extraordinary talents and remarkable qualities. This club exists to honour, commemorate, and perpetuate his legacy. Would I therefore incur the ire of Scott's aficionados by writing a book which would not display him in the best light? After she'd read the copy of my book, which I'd sent her, I shared my concerns on this scene with Poppy Anderson, widow of Sir Eric Anderson, sometime president of this club and a man to whom we're all so greatly indebted for his superb edition of Scott's journal. In the course of an exchange of emails, I wrote as follows in response to Poppy's having expressed sadness at what became of Scott in Italy on that last foreign visit, as revealed in the final chapters of my book, when so many, including his own children, commented often harshly on his deteriorating mental and physical state. I too revere Scott, I said, and find him admirable. That made it difficult to tackle an aspect of his life that did not, in some ways, show him at his best. In discussing how the world saw him towards the end, I tried not to diminish his status, even when he was himself diminished by age, infirmity, and attitude to abroad. In 1826, Scott found himself the unlikely putative recipient of a book dedication. Charlotte Eaton wanted to inscribe to him her fact-based novel, Continental Adventures. His refusal of this dubious honour was motivated, I think, by his realisation of its inappropriateness. Charlotte Eaton, née Waldy, had travelled in Europe very much more widely than he had. She was much less timid and much more opinionated. She knew Rome very well. He'd never been there, despite having told everyone who would listen from at least 1826 onwards how much he was anxious to visit Italy as the heartland of the old Grand Tour. The essential difference between them was that whereas Mrs. Eaton had travelled in actuality, Scott had done so vicariously in his imagination and at second hand. His reading of the history and topography of places that others had seen for themselves had given him an extraordinary familiarity with much of Europe without ever needing to leave his study in Castle Street or his library at Abbotsford. Her entreaties to allow the dedication having been rejected, all Charlotte Eaton could do was to put into the mouth of her heroine parodies of famous verses from Scott's Lay of the Last Minstrel, which turned O Caledonia stern and wild into O Italy serene and mild, and so on. In this she was clever, and it was a most effective and surprising opening to her novel. One wonders what Scott thought of this audacity. He himself subscribed very much to the technique of Mrs. Anne Radcliffe, whom he praised for her ability to convey descriptions of foreign scenery based on what she had observed in 17th century landscape paintings or had read of in travel literature. This kind of mediated view was what Scott himself depended on all his literary life. So Scott was never fated to make a conventional grand tour. Lack of opportunity, the time, whenever it might be, was always wrong, combined with lack of overwhelming inclination. Furthermore, he had no professional need to go to Italy. He was not an artist or an architect, and so a visit was never required as part of a training. Conversely, he did have a need to be in Edinburgh, because first he had a career to forge in the law, and then increasingly another career to take forward and ever upwards as a man of letters. France, Germany, Switzerland, and even Italy always had a rival in Scott's mind, heart, and affections. Abbotsford and Tweedside. No one ever expressed the basic and essential problem with Scott as a continental traveller manqué better than did Captain Basil Hall in 1833, when he was able to epitomise the essence of his late friend's dilemma. Scott's secret reluctance, as Hall put it, his secret reluctance to root himself up from his house and home, his dearly beloved black letter library, his musty papers, and his cherished plantations, in which he took infinitely more delight than in all the society and scenery of the rest of the world besides. The story of Scott's relationship with continental travel is deeply intriguing. We have 3 actual trips to consider, but these are balanced by the catalogue of those many more expeditions planned, postponed, avoided, or merely dreamt of. The idea of Scott and the Grand Tour as that institution was nearing its end is a fascinating conceit, because it can be discussed both in the realm of the actual, the journeys he made, and those also in the realm of the imagination and the notion of what he might have done. Where did Scott's imagination take him? Where might he have travelled had the peculiar combination of opportunities and disincentives that governed his thoughts and actions somehow come into agreement? In 1798, he wanted to go to the mountains of Styria, and in 1821, Gratz again called. He never went on either occasion. In 1808 and later, he fantasized about going to Portugal and Spain, essentially to see for himself how the Peninsular War was being conducted. The poet of Marmion and the amateur soldier of the Royal Edinburgh Volunteer Light Dragoons would see real action, except that he didn't go. The so-called Ashestiel, in the so-called Ashestiel fragment of autobiography, otherwise known as the memoirs, he claimed a lifelong delight in travelling, while admitting that he'd never enjoyed that pleasure on a large scale. Some small understatement, other than in a domestic context. He did not have that pleasure because he deliberately avoided foreign travel. A remark of his father's, also recorded in the memoirs, that the young Scot seemed born to be a strolling pedlar, was in turn translated in Redgauntlet into the elder Fairford's observation that Darcy Latimer had best apply himself to the law, else he goes scouring the country like a landlouper, it's a vagabond or adventurer, going he knows not where, to see he knows not what. All opportunity Scott himself had to vagabondize in the peninsula was passed up. He was no Washington Irving, still less a Byron. And because of this caution and timidity and the procrastination and the prevarication that is early detected in Scott's very modest career as a traveller on the continent, he was mocked mercilessly by Byron as a home-keeping minstrel. The minstrel kept at home still later and never made the many visits to German lands of which he often spoke, and which he might much more reasonably and easily have attempted. He never carried through any of his projected trips to Switzerland and the Alps, so greatly extolled, but never actually visited. And yet he adhered to the notion of producing a major travel book that might take the form of a series of letters from the continent. This idea was first conceived in 1818, and the earliest occasion when such letters might well have been written and collected for publication was a projected visit to Portugal in 1819. That trip too never came to fruition. In the last year of his life, when in Naples, he thought actively of going to Corfu and thence into Greek lands and waters proper, to cruise in a Royal Navy vessel through the Aegean to Athens and then to Rhodes, maybe even to Constantinople, perhaps even to Alexandria. For a lifelong non-classicist, this late in the day conversion to the dream of Hellas was remarkable. And Scott breezily suggested that such stravaiging might easily produce as many as 6 volumes of published travel letters, or else a tour journal. The sad fact, however, is that Scott's lawyers' concern about possible invalidation of his clients' insurance policies put paid to any such notion of wider travel rather beyond and out with the ambit of the traditional grand tour. Scott's own late and most modest of grand tours was thus ending in spring 1832 in a strangely sub-fusc, unromantic, almost Victorian world of insurance policies and risk. Indeed, the flurry of letters to and from the lawyer, John Gibson WS, Scott's publisher, Robert Cadell, and Scott's family might well betoken the absolute definitive end of the Grand Tour itself as an institution based upon the premises of excitement and discovery, one where young men had traditionally grown to maturity, despite all manner of rollicking adventures and risk-taking of every description, from the religious, intellectual, and political to the physical, moral, and sexual, and even brushes with the grim reaper. Here now, instead, was a sick old man with a life policy and a careful Edinburgh solicitor to raise issues of prudence and precaution. The Greek scheme is blown up, Scott had to record with genuine regret. At the very end, it appears, he'd suddenly become adventurous, and almost recklessly so. Others stopped him being young again. The first actual encounter with Europe had been in 1815, when Scott rushed over to Belgium, northern France, and Paris, as soon as he could free himself from legal duties and literary commitments. His visit to the field of Waterloo was a highlight. All gruesome signs of the great battle in terms of mangled and decayed corpses of men and horses had been buried or burned. Nearly 8 weeks had passed since the action. Scott was clearly disappointed not to have seen more ghastliness or to have smelled more stench of death in the heat of a summer day. He collected relics as if he'd been at an ancient Roman site visited on the Grand Tour. He was one of the inventors of what we now call battlefield tourism. In Paris, during a long visit, he moved in the highest circles and investigated every aspect of Parisian society and culture, including the demi-monde of the Palais Royal and the ice cream delights of the Café des Mille Colonnes, presided over by the famous Belle Limonadière. One suspects that Charlotte Scott may not have been told quite everything. Scott and his contemporaries were able to see in the Louvre the looted art of Europe before its restitution. The sights of the Grand Tour came to them, in a manner of speaking, without the need to go to Italy to see princely collections in situ. Along with his second and much shorter Paris visit of 1826, this French trip constitutes the most splendid of Scott's precious few personal and direct encounters with the world of the old Grand Tour, except that Paris was merely the place where many a traditional Grand Tour began, rather than being an end in itself or the real essence of the larger whole. Scott had to make the very most of the experience. His one published travel book, the admirable and lively Paul's Letters to His Kinsfolk, shows what he might have given us had all those later ideas in 1825 was not really, as I well know, to go abroad, but it was still to cross a narrow sea, albeit within the territorial limits of the relatively new United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. It was as near to going abroad as the tourist could do without actually crossing to the continent. I argue that Scott's visit constitutes a kind of Grand Tour in microcosm, and that it was a sort of substitute for wider overseas travel. The heat that July in Ireland was Mediterranean. Scott was fetid as he had been in Paris, and as he would be in Naples and Rome. The Paddies seemed akin to Neapolitans in their primitive lives and lawless behaviour. There were lots of ruins, both secular and ecclesiastical, to see and to lament in their decay. There was popish folly to mock and to be amazed by. The Scott party could even look at pretty young nuns in close seclusion, as lascivious grand tourists like to do in Iberia or Italy. I absolve Scott and J.G. Lockhart from this sort of Me Too charge, but reserve my judgment on Captain Walter Scott, the baronet's elder son, whose posting to Dublin was the ostensible cause of his father's visit to Green Erin. The man who rowed Scott and Maria Edgeworth across the Lake of Killarney remembered ever afterwards having done so. A quarter of a century later, this same boatman told Lord Macaulay, then also a tourist, that his service to Scott on that occasion had been some compensation for his having missed a local hanging that same day. And so we come to the trip to the Mediterranean in 1831. One reason why Scott did not want to travel in Europe may be that he did not want reality to spoil his vision of a world he knew very well, perhaps well enough, from secondary sources, from published works of history and topography, or books illustrated with an increasingly large range of engraved or lithographed image of European destinations, or from the accounts of friends and acquaintances, either sent to him spontaneously or upon his request for information about specific locality or particular circumstance. He had travelled widely in the library. It was only when he was very unwell and prematurely aged, when his imagination was all but spent and his literary career was staggering to its end through his last weak novels, so difficult to complete to anyone's satisfaction, that, worn out, he at last acceded to the worn-out status of the grand tourist. Had the Admiralty not made his voyage south possible in HMS Barham, I doubt whether Scott would ever have visited Malta, certainly, but quite possibly not even Naples, Rome, Florence, Venice, and the rest of the landmark stages of the old Grand Tour itinerary. Malta inspired him to think of and actually to write a new story. During 4 months in Naples, he was happier than he was in 3 weeks in Rome, but that's not to say that he was very happy anywhere in Italy. An extraordinary discovery is that he seems to have taken along with him prints of Scottish scenes to hang up in his temporary accommodation. Now, every other grand tourist would surely have bought gouaches of the Bay of Naples or veduti etchings of the monuments and buildings of Rome by Piranesi and his followers. But this accords perfectly with what we know of Scott's interests in Naples and Rome. Every Italian scene was compared, usually unfavourably, with the Scottish view. Scott's songs and ballads came constantly into his head in the most improbable situations. Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Jacobites intruded on every conversation. His companion and Cicerone, the distinguished classical archaeologist Sir William Gell, could barely elicit a minute's interest on Scott's part in anything Greek or Roman, and was at a loss to explain Scott's attitude to antiquity, real antiquity as Gell saw it, not merely the medieval stuff. At school, Scott had been called the Greek blockhead, and later he said that he had the brain of an unlettered Goth. Now he delighted in telling Gell that John Morritt said that the study and appreciation of classical antiquity could not be knocked into his head because his skull was too thick. But I hope in Frolics to have shed some new light on Scott's possible attitude to the ruins of Pompeii. His celebrated mutterings about the city of the dead, uttered as he shuffled apparently reluctantly along the streets, more interested in the prospect of lunch set at a table in the Forum and a quiet riposo to follow, may not be so banal as we have imagined, and may just possibly be seen as the start of a new romantic aesthetic. The recently discovered journal of the acerbic Marianne Talbot supplies some wonderful new evidence for Scott's life in Naples. She quotes the comments of Scott's émigré Glasgow physician, Edward Hogg, on the Scott family parties being quite an ordinary Scotch family in their interior, that's when at home in their rented apartment. They storm and scold and swear. This and much else leads one to a different view of grand tourists in soft Parthenope. It's a deeply moving thing to read the journal entry of Miss Talbot's, where she describes a visit to poor Sir Walter. In her shocked state of feeling at his palpable decay, she found it necessary to explain herself to her own journal. Think of saying, poor Sir Walter. He could hardly rise from his chair to welcome me. His speech was so defective that I could hardly hear him. How sad to see genius and imagination brought so low. For a man in the state Sir Walter is in throws a chill over a whole society. It's impossible not to watch him and to attend to him. It is most melancholy to see the glory of England and Scotland sent to visit strangers and appear thus. Miss Talbot also observed, most tellingly, I think, that Scott seemed tired with heat and light and foreigners. These three essential elements of the Grand Tour experience, heat, light, and foreigners, appeared not to agree with him. Knowing that Scott had taken rooms in the Palazzo d'Aquino di Caramanico, I assumed that this was the palace of that name in Via Medina, in the center of the old city of Naples. But then I realized that there were two Palazzi Caramanico, and that he had in fact lived in the other one, in the fashionable San Fernando district, west of the Castel del Ovo and below the hill of Pizzo Falcone towards the Riviera di Chiaia. This was the Palazzo Caramanico al Chiatamone. Scott wrote one letter to Lockhart addressed from what he called Chiademana. This incorrect name provided my clue. And I will show you now this painting of Naples at almost exactly the correct time of Scott's visit. And there is where Scott lived. That is the San Fernando district. That's the Palazzo dell'Ovo. This is the hill of Pizzo Falcone. And so Scott was looking out to the view to the west, to Posillipo, which is up here. In Naples, during Scott's residence, there were 2 Waverley balls. As Scott's younger son, Charles, a fledgling diplomat attached to the British legation, told a friend, these required participants to dress as characters from what Charles ladishly called the governor's novels. High society clamoured for invitations and the best roles. A beautiful Neapolitan girl was heartbroken because her devout Catholic family would not countenance her appearing as Rebecca the Jewess in Ivanhoe. At a palace levee, Scott was presented to King Ferdinand of the 2 Sicilies. He had taken along the appropriate dress for just such an occasion. His uniform as a brigadier in the Royal Company of Archers, King's bodyguard for Scotland. Scott suddenly became concerned to turn for home. For the British, seeking the warm south had become a romantic trope, as overgrown Italian cemeteries testify to this day. Many never benefited from travel as a health cure. Ever since he contemplated going to Portugal in 1819, Scott had been haunted by the fear of dying abroad, like 2 great novelist predecessors, Fielding and Smollett. The irony is that had he indeed succumbed to illness or exhaustion in Italy, he might actually have stood higher in posterity's regard as a tragic hero of the kind the British like best. Would he have lain with Keats and Shelley in the Protestant cemetery in Rome? As a traveller, Byron beats him dramatically in the Romantic stakes, and Byron's death in Greece was almost a soldier's one, of the kind Scott might rather have liked for himself. But Scott struggled home in a pathetic state between life and death to a lingering end at Abbotsford. To die there was what he wanted, and as we all know, his last weeks and dissolution were certainly extremely affecting. At any rate, as Lockhart represents them, the reality may have been somewhat different. But would not a less protracted but more romantic end in Italy have been equally touching, if not more so? Greatest Scotsman and greatest writer in the English language dies abroad, the newspapers might have announced, if we can imagine how such news might play in today's media. As a friend closely connected with the so-called non-Catholic Acattolico cemetery in Rome has suggested to me, a Scott grave there would have done wonders for the cemetery standing on the tourist route all these years past. Classical Rome mattered little to Scott. The medieval in the city and its environs moved him more. But he was most affected by, obsessed is not too strong a word, memories of the exiled Stuart dynasty, once tenants at Palazzo del Re of a latterly patience-exhausted papacy. In my book, I investigate the significance of one narrative painting seen by Scott at Villa Muti at Frascati. It is now in the Scottish National Portrait Gallery. Scott's visit to the Stuart monument in St. Peter's Basilica was an event imbued with sadness. Richard Monckton Milnes's poem captures this extremely well. It's not been properly understood, and I discuss its emotional impact. A happy moment for Scott was an alfresco breakfast on the Palatine Hill at the so-called Boschetto Gelio, nestling in the delicious Farnese Gardens. Here Sir William Gell lived with Charles Mills in an eccentric villa that must have made the begetter of Abbotsford feel at home. Adorned as it was with stucco thistles, gingerbread masonry fancies, and abundance of other details in a style known in Rome, I wonder why, as Scotch Gothic. In my book, I refer to the suggestion that the Russian princess Zinaida Volkonsky had erected a monument of some kind to Scott in the garden of her villa. But evidence was, as far as I could see, wholly lacking, and I dismissed this as mere speculation, as most things written about Scott, the princess, and her Russian friends in Rome are speculative. But no sooner was Frolics published than a chance email exchange with Sir John Shepherd, former British ambassador in Rome and an acquaintance of mine, about the book he was writing in the Villa Volkonsky, now the embassy residence, informed me that such a monument did indeed exist. All but forgotten, it has recently been unearthed, almost literally, but more accurately, freed from weeds and undergrowth in the overgrown villa garden. Of a form closely resembling an ancient Roman milestone, as which it may indeed actually have started life, it bears the inscription in French, "The quiet lamp of our conversations has been extinguished." And here, due to the courtesy of John Shepherd, I'm able to show you two photographs of the Scott monument, so long forgotten, in the garden of the Villa Volkonsky. The road from Rome has been well described as Scott's Via Dolorosa, and his later journey down the Rhine, which brought on his final devastating stroke at Nijmegen, proved to be that of a Flumen Dolorosum. The second last letter Scott is known to have written was to his daughter Sophia. This was scribbled barely legibly at Terni, early in the morning of the second day on the journey north from Rome, but it was never sent. In it, I discovered something very interesting. Scott had told Sophia that he would leave the rest to her sister Anne, who has learned the cant of an amateur to the same purpose that most travellers do. If one interprets his words correctly, he seems to have maintained to the last a real distance from the Grand Tour aesthetic, and even to have held its sensibilities in something approaching distrust, if not outright contempt. The cant of the amateur, as he called it, is the exclusive language and the cultural and aesthetic outlook of the lover of the arts, literally an amateur, that most grand tourists had sought to acquire. It's almost as if Scott had deliberately shunned such acquisition of taste as mannered and affected. As a literary and social lion, Scott suffered much for much of his life from the unwelcome attentions of lion hunters, as these parasites were termed at the time. A particularly annoying American female of the species, Miss Harriet Douglas of New York, pursued him through Italy. Her hounding coloured his last weeks on tour, but he was at last free of her to journey through the Tyrol and southern Germany to Mainz and the Rhine. At Frankfurt, a touching scene unfolded in the bookseller's shop. There he was shown a lithograph of a British country house. The shopman, only knowing that what he called an English party was in his premises, had brought out from his stock the one object he surely knew would be of interest. It was a print of Abbotsford. Scott, unrecognised, muttered, "I know that already, sir," and hurpled away. He was going home to die. Thank you.
Iain, thank you so very much indeed. I'm extremely interesting. You've kindly said that you're willing to answer a question or two, and may I?
You kindly said I'm willing to.
May I try one on you, please? You show, and it's very moving, that at the end in this second last letter, in a sense, Walter Scott turns his back on the classical tour and refers to the cant of the amateur. Nonetheless, in the first chapter of your book, I think very powerfully and very effectively show what was a transition between the classical grand tour and then the romantic one.
Yes, yes.
Now, were any of, to your knowledge, were any of the followers of Scott imitators of him in the way in which he obsessively collected objects, and these objects populated his historic imagination? Were the Europeans who were after Marie Antoinette's handbag, or the dagger that stabbed Julius Caesar, did he inspire that kind of collecting?
Well, remember that when Scott went to the field of Waterloo, he was by no means alone, and the industry in relics, which was well established, Scott was quite lucky to be able to get his Waterloo cuirass and his soldier's pocketbook and his buttons and whatnot, because the ground so thoroughly picked clean. In fact, he brought home very little else from any of his continental tours. From Italy, he brought home next to nothing. He bought a lot of books in Naples, clearly thinking that his time in Naples would allow him some months, he hoped years, of productivity in the literary field when he came home. We all know that he'd already written The Siege of Malta and sent that manuscript home. He'd written Il Bizarro. He hoped that he would produce these 6 volumes of letters. So his purchases in Italy were very largely those of books. I don't think you mentioned, or you were suggesting that perhaps other people wanted, in a sense, to travel in Scott's footsteps. I'm afraid Scott's legacy as a grand tourist was not followed up. Indeed, we get that very harsh comment by Dickens at the end of the decade of the 1830s, by almost holding up as an example of how not to do things the example of Scott, whom he very cruelly calls, well, Scott was a driveler. I mean, Dickens, in a sense, held up the example of Scott, how not to do things. Scott had palpably left it all far too late. So in a sense, Scott's grand tour is hermetically sealed all by itself. Nobody followed. Everybody wanted to travel like Byron. Nobody, I'm afraid, wanted to travel like Scott. So it's a one-off thing, and he really didn't collect much at all. Anyway,
thank you. Thank you. Now, Michael, can you see anyone else waving a hand who'd like to ask a question?
Indeed, Alistair Hutton is.
Alistair.
Hello,
Alistair. Thank you very much for a really fascinating tour de table. That was wonderful, and I shall let John Shepherd know that his book has been publicized more widely by you. Now, I was just wondering if Scott's contemporary knowledge of the depredations of Napoleon Bonaparte and the treatment of his wife's family as Huguenots had influenced his view of the continent of Europe.
Well, Scott did not, as you well know, probably better than I do, in Paul's letters to his kinsfolk. He actually describes Napoleon's depredations as being akin to those of a highwayman, And Scott really felt that it was right and proper that the collected art of Europe be returned to those countries. He thought, although it was terribly convenient for him, who didn't really want to be in Europe at all, and certainly didn't want to travel very widely, he thought it would be much healthier for young artists to go beyond Paris, to go to the Italian cities and to the Italian palazzi where these works of art had come from, rather than just taking the soft option of being able to see it all gathered together in Europe. When, of course, he went to Paris for the second time, it was in pursuit of the records of Napoleon for his great biography, which he was doing at that time. But no, he was very clear-eyed about Napoleon's depredations, and the sadness of the Parisians preparing to say goodbye to the art of Italy that they had accumulated in Paris is rather amusingly put, as indeed many of Scott's contemporaries recorded how the Apollo Belvedere, for instance, was packed up in his coffin, as they said, in a packing case, ready to come home. And Scott didn't seem to have bothered to go up the Arc du Carrousel to see the horses of San Marco close up, but other people did. The journalist John Scott. It's quite awkward, but at the same time, there were several people called Scott in Paris. One has to be very careful to make quite clear whose records are whose. But John Scott went up on top of the Arc to see these things being loosened. And Scott himself, of course, records how the wedges were being hammered beneath the statues to loosen them from their temporary bases in the Louvre. Give John Shepherd my best wishes. He mentioned you the other day.
Michael, can you see anyone else?
No one else yet.
I think people want some wine.
Well, good. Ian, I while I was reading your book, and I need to spotlight myself. Something I loved taking away from your book was this thing you mentioned how it's hard to write about Scott in this day and age when he's seen as so kind of unfashionable and like. But I came away with a very sort of sympathetic portrait of someone who, yeah, as you say, traveled through reading, loved the scenery around himself, and you know, his letters to friends on the continent are always, "Could you bring me back some books? Get some pamphlets for me?" And he's saying that to his sons later on as well. I suppose you mentioned coronavirus and lockdowns and the like. And it sort of strikes me that the only thing that would be a bit of a pain to Scott in this day and age would be getting hold of materials from the continent to sit by the Tweed reading.
Yes.
Is there a sense that there's a bit of a you know, in the age of the staycation and ecotourism, that there's space for Scott, the armchair traveller?
Well, I think if Scott hadn't gone, I mean, he'd have been perfectly happy to continue to get his knowledge, as he always had done, from the library. As I have tried to say in my talk tonight, he really, even at the end, didn't want to go. He went to oblige his family, and he was, I think, persuaded by the obvious interest that government showed in his health. I hate the phrase "a national treasure." I mean, every Tom, Dick, or Harry is a national treasure in common parlance these days. But I think that it was quite extraordinary that within 2 days, Scott's voyage to the Mediterranean was fixed up. And I print for the first time the letter of Sir James Graham, First Lord of the Admiralty, a Graham of Netherby, a borderer, who wrote to Scott saying how pleased he, James Graham, had been to be able to fix this up as a tribute to the minstrel of my native hills. But I think had Scott not acceded to that, he'd have been perfectly happy never to see Italy. He'd have continued to get his information from his friends like Samuel Rogers. He'd have continued to get it from all the many books he looked at. He would have been he wouldn't have lost very much, I don't think. Anyway, here we are.
Could I ask a question of Mr. Brown?
Hello, yes.
Hello, I'm Mr. Manier from London, Ontario, Canada. Could you repeat the inscription on the monument that was unearthed in Italy in tribute to Scott?
Yes, it is the, hang on, the quiet lamp of our conversations has been extinguished.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Anyone else? If not, could I ask Hugh Salverson if he would give a vote of thanks, please?
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Michael, for inviting me to say a few words before we all disperse. Most members of the club will not know me yet because with exquisite timing, I became a member in February 2020. So I haven't really witnessed the club very much yet, and nor am I much of a Scott scholar. I confess that I've read only 5 of the Waverley novels, but I have read quite a lot about Scott, and no book about Scott have I enjoyed more than the one by Iain Gordon Brown, which I bought immediately on its appearance last autumn. I'm very grateful to Iain Gordon Brown this evening for talking to us in a way which illuminated the book. He didn't simply tell us what we might read if we were, what we might learn if we were to read the book, which I guess most of us have already done, and which we will now do if we haven't yet done. Instead, he told us what it was like to write it. I was interested to hear about the challenges of writing about an author who is, frankly, rather unfashionable at this time against the background of Brexit and the emerging pandemic. I was struck also by the story he told of writing about a subject which was ostensibly rather unfruitful. Here was a man who didn't really like traveling very much and traveled very little. And yet it turned out to be a fascinating story because also it enlarges our understanding of Scott, especially in the account of his trip to Italy at the end, because it's so affecting in its portrayal of this slightly pathetic dying man. And there was a review in last week's TLS of a new biography of D.H. Lawrence, which quoted a remark by Catherine Mansfield to the effect that it is precisely the quotidian, the apparently trivial and banal in a biography which makes it real. And something of that came over in this evening's talk as we had these images of the Scott stumbling along in the streets of Pompeii, not really enjoying it very much, of hanging pictures of the Trossachs in his hotel room in Naples, and absurdly wearing the uniform of an archer to his audience with the King of the Two Sicilies. This is a bit sad, but it's also deeply human, and it has certainly greatly enhanced my appreciation of the man. Such a pity he wasn't able to get more out of Germany. I have thought from my scant experience of Scott, but my quite extensive experience of Germany, that he would actually have loved Germany if he had gone there as a younger man.
He would, yes.
His journey down the Rhine, had he been well enough to enjoy it, would have appealed to everything about him.
Yes.
But the climate would have suited him better than the Bay of Naples, and he would probably have enjoyed the food. And it is such a pity that he never met Goethe, for both men.
Indeed.
It is one of the great regrets of European civilization that these two figures never met.
Yeah.
So to sum up, I think we've had a wonderful experience this evening, listening to the story of the genesis of this book and enhancing our understanding of its subject. And as a former member of Her Majesty's Diplomatic Service, I am especially pleased to hear that there is a statue of Scott, after all, in the garden of the ambassador's residence in Rome. So thank you very much, Iain, for a fascinating evening. And I hope you will all now join me in expressing your enthusiasm in its as Zoom allows us to do. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, too.
Hugh, Hugh, thank you very much indeed. Iain, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I look forward to seeing you. And I look forward to seeing many of you on the 21st of August for Kenilworth. So thank you for coming. Very best wishes to you all.
Thank you, Iain. Thank you, Hugh. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Lee, for everything you and Michael always do for us. It's a great club. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Bye.